Okay, in our last video on learning, before moving on to incentives, we will talk about vicarious learning. So taking us back to really the very first lecture of this class, was briefly brought up the differences between things like learning and ability versus motivation, and also versus just performance and behavior, right? And how both learning and ability, as well as motivation, are important for performance and behavior. Conditioning theories often don't make this distinction between learning and motivation clear. And so, right, oftentimes what is measured is behavior or increase in behavior or performance in these conditioning research studies. But what's not made clear is whether that increase in behavior is a product of motivation or learning. That's where Tolman comes in. And so Tolman makes a couple of key points. The first is that learning can occur without motivation. And the second is that learned behavior is only exhibited if it satisfies some sort of a goal. So if you recall Thorndike's law, we talked about this in the operant conditioning section. So Thorndike's law of effect concerns performance, and not learning per se, right? So I mean, the idea of that law of effect was to get at learning, but really what's directly measured in that is just increase in performance, and doesn't provide, I guess, direct evidence that that is learning. So we're going to talk about two examples of learning without motivation. The first is latent learning, and the second is social learning. So with latent learning here, latent learning, what it is basically is just learning that is not made clear before an incentive, or in other words, it's not made obvious that the individual or animal or whatever learns that behavior before some sort of reward or incentive is presented. And so this is evidence for learning without reinforcement. This chart that you see here is from another rat and maze study. Obviously, it's very common for these behavioral / learning types of study research. And so what happened was, rats tried to get to the end of the maze, and what was measured was errors in getting to the end of the maze. So, taking a wrong direction or whatever. And so what was manipulated was how often the rat received reinforcement or reward. So it could have been after either every trial, after 7 trials, or after 3 and 7 trials. And so as we see here, for the every trial, the learning seems to be happening about as we expect, right? So the rats are exploring the maze, they learn how to get to the end, get to that incentive, and the error rate decreases. Interestingly, for the rats that only receive incentive after that 7th trial, right? That's this line here. It doesn't appear that there was all that much learning before that incentive, right? But as you can see, the rats really did learn after that incentive for trials 8 and 9. They're like, all right, yes, I got it. I'm going to do it. So they clearly were exploring, learning the maze, but they didn't demonstrate that learning until that incentive was provided. And that's the idea of latent learning. And you see a similar thing here, where that learning is really displayed after the incentive. And so what does this mean? This emphasizes, again, what was talked about in that initial lecture, that performance, right, is a product of both learning and motivation. And so this right here, that's a signal of motivation, and that learning was only shown when there was motivation to do so. this other examples of this, I think examples are easier to come up with kids. Really young kids are good at acquiring language, but even if they're not really able to produce that language yet, additionally, with, let's say a math problem, a child can know how to solve a math problem, but unless there's an incentive to do that or some sort of motivational factor, it won't be too likely that that kid is going to present what has been learned, right? So example 2 is social learning. Basically, this is vicarious learning through the observation of others. It's also called modeling. Models, an example, are other people in the environment who are exhibiting certain behaviors. Usually this is thought of as in terms of children being the ones doing the vicarious learning and the parent or some sort of adult figure doing the behavior that the child observes. And then that child will often replicate the behavior, right? So social learning, but there's not a direct reinforcement, right? It's just the child watches the adult, whoever it is, and performing behavior and then replicates that, but there's no real reinforcement there, but that behavior is learned anyways. And I know I'm talking about this in terms of children because that's the way it's most commonly thought of, but adults definitely do this too. The most, I think, common study to provide evidence for this social learning is a Bobo doll study by Vicarious. So definitely watch this video. It'll just show what I'm talking about here. But basically what we see is that initially an adult figure will be acting aggressively towards this Bobo doll, hitting it, throwing it around, what have you. And then it'll be the child's turn who just observed the adult doing this, and without any incentive, any instruction, and any other reason to do so, these children will replicate those behaviors and show social learning, and will act aggressively towards the Bobo dolls as well. Yeah. So this can also, one possible conclusion from the Bobo doll study, or from Bandura's work in general, or just from theory on social learning, is that media exposure could lead to unwanted social learning, oftentimes in the form of aggression, especially with kids, and oftentimes by media exposure. This can be in the form of, video games, violence in movies, whatever it might be. So there is pretty consistent evidence for this. I know it's a pretty highly debated topic, but in the realm of psychology, multiple studies have been done on this, and there does seem to be evidence for the notion that violence in the media can lead to unwanted social learning in the form of aggression. But this study particularly was on a racing game and got at the question of, does this association depend on how the violence is presented? And so, in other words, whether that violence is rewarded or punished. And so in this car racing game, there are a few different possibilities. So one is that, and so in this game, you can kind of drive on the sidewalk sometimes and run over and kill pedestrians. And so it's possible in this game that you could be rewarded and get more points for killing pedestrians. It's possible that you could be punished and get less points for killing pedestrians, or it's possible that at some points the game won't let you drive on the sidewalk at all. And therefore there's no possibility for this violence or aggression or anything. You can't run over the pedestrians. So some interesting results here. It does seem like, so these are just the results based on condition. So that reward condition, punishment condition, and then it wasn't an option or a non-violent condition. And so as you can see, there seems to be more anger or they call it aggressive affect, but it's basically similar, if not the same thing as anger. More aggressive thoughts and more aggressive behavior in the form of a noise blast, which is actually one of my just favorite social psychology dependent variables, is how basically with this noise blast, there's the option to give a different participant a noise blast that's just really annoying for that other participant. And you can determine how loud that noise is. And so, louder noises are then measured as more aggression. And so, again, there seems to be more anger, aggressive thoughts, and aggressive behavior when that violence was rewarded versus punished, and versus the non-violent condition. Interestingly, though, while there does seem to be differences between this reward and punishment condition as well, punishment of that violence did not seem to reduce these aggression measures all the way to the nonviolent condition, giving evidence that no matter how this aggression is dealt with, right, it's the exposure that leads to these aggressive tendencies. Now, it does seem to matter to some extent whether it's that aggression is rewarded or that violence is rewarded or punished, but it's not like punishing this aggression after the exposure is a full decrease back to the nonviolent condition. So that was an example or some evidence for short-term effects. There's also evidence for long-term effects of this. So this is a longitudinal study just showing that exposure to violent TV is linked to aggression later in life. So what was measured was preference for violent TV at the age of 8. And then many years later, at the age of 30, seriousness of criminal convictions was measured. And so the seriousness of these convictions, right, is a lot higher for those who really preferred violent TV when they were 8. There are definitely a lot of variables to go to these things, and even this can be potentially a little bit misleading because not all crime is violent, right? But typically, as you get more serious in your crimes, that's an indication of, to some extent, increased aggression, increased violence, even though, especially at the lower end, not all crimes are violent. But again, there is definitely a lot of debate on this topic, especially when it comes to things like, mass murders. And I think it's really complicated. So I have not personally read anything specific to mass murders in terms of violent video games or violence on TV or anything like that. But just in, again, what I've gone through in the realm of psychology, there does seem to be pretty consistent evidence that, especially at a young age for kids, exposure to this violence or aggression through video games, TV, what have you, just does not seem to be great. And theoretically, that's due to social learning. All right, that is it for learning. Be back with the next videos, next topic, going over incentives.